I'll be reading from page 158. The title is A Young Woman from eShowe. I have been here since morning. I have a lot of things to do today. If I don't get done over here at least by this afternoon, I won't be able to do other important things. I have no choice. If I'm to be employed, I need to reapply for an ID. These were the words of a woman we met at Home Affairs in the early morning of one cold Tuesday in 2014. The woman seemed so overwhelmed, not only by what she had to do in one day, but by life itself. According to her, on that day, she had to fetch a form to apply for funding to study, but that depended on her being able to print out an acceptance letter from the university, which had offered her a conditional offer, to accompany the application for funding. Before she could go to Home Affairs, she had to secure space for her mother at a local hospital so that she could be attended to by the doctor. In her community, like many other Black communities, doctors are known for only seeing a certain number of patients a day. The scramble to see the doctor was always a matter of life and death in her community. Her mother was a retired nurse. Ironically, this was a retired nurse whose medical aid had not come handy for over a year and therefore had to seek refuge at the local clinic. Certain people had taken advantage of the fact that one had to struggle so much to see the doctor, and they used this as an opportunity to make money. They woke up early in the morning, around 3 or 4 a.m., to keep spaces in the queue for anyone who would be willing to buy these spaces. And those who had the means to buy their way through would do so. Unfortunately, she was one of those who did not have the means to buy any space in the queue, and therefore, her mom could have been one of those who had been told to return after your funeral. As though she was narrating her story for something more important than a mere conversation with strangers, she effortlessly yet emotionally spoke of the countless times she went to town and her prospective institution of higher learning. She told us particularly of the frustration she had to encounter in almost all the institutions she had gone to. With the palpable gathering of tears in her eyes, she spoke of her brother, who was living with chronic asthma. They had lived for a very long time in a community that was surrounded by petrochemical industries, the Durban South Basin, before moving to an area west of Durban called Kwandengis. Without one having to probe much into what could have been the cause of asthma, she asserted, "I guess my brother's asthma is because of the environment we live in, and yeah, I don't know, it's so dirty. Our water is not always clean. When I have some cash, I pay to fetch water from a household 100 meters away from our place. But that has not always been the case because I also use the money on transport and other necessities. But as for the billowing smoke around our place, we could in no way run away from it." She continued to express herself solemnly. "When I got a job at a bakery in Pinetown, I thought that it won't be necessary for me to carry a lunchbox to work. To my surprise and the surprise of the other workers, the manager told us that we are all not allowed to eat the company food. He told us that if we want to eat the bread, we must wait until we are paid. This became a problem because over and above the cost of transporting myself to work, the cost of a lunchbox would take a huge chunk of my money." To her dismay, the seductive promises of securing employment do not hold and have never held any guarantee of a good life. She continued, "I always believed that when I hear on the news that petrol prices will come down, we will pay less for transport, but no, because taxi owners say that car parts are expensive. So it's not only petrol prices that count, they say it's much more." In addition to this, she had issues with the bank deducting a portion of her salary without her consent. Having to work from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. did not make this easier, as she did not always have time to go to the bank to inquire about that. All these circumstances forced her into a cycle of debt that meant she had to borrow money from a money lender who kept her ID until the loan was fully repaid. I could not repay the loan in a short time, and the money lender lost my ID. I could not ask her too many questions because indeed I had taken too long to pay up. They looked for it from a stack of other IDs, but they could not find it. That is why I'm here at Home Affairs, to try and see if I could get another. The conversation gave us more about her life, particularly her day-to-day lived experiences. It came out that she was typical of those black women whose lives are constantly fraught with inconveniences, vulnerabilities, and incompleteness. It is those black women who would go all over the show to make their lives and those of their families meaningful against all odds. And yet, by doing so, they encounter seemingly insurmountable odds. These are particularly black women who live most of their lives jumping from the raging fires of unemployment to the frying pan of underemployment so that they can put bread on the table. She, like any other poor black woman, always sought to hold the knife on the sharp edge and face the world with a smile on her face, hid the scars in her soul. To everyone, she was just fine. Her everyday attempts, like those of many other black women, to ward off difficulties that never tired to manifest themselves daily, rendered her life a series of unending defeats. It is because of one such defeat that she had to brace the cold morning of that particular Tuesday to go to Home Affairs. Armed with determination, she had given herself over to the processes and procedures of officialdom to make sure that all her documents were in order. After all, that was required by the labor markets upon which she and many other people of her class, race, and gender depends. She was thus more than prepared to endure anything just to get her names in the official books and files of the Republic, a republic that in no way would recognize her as its part. And to constantly stave off temptations to give up on life, antidepressants had become her common stress alleviation medication. She never wished to drown in her tears of sorrow. Amid so many problems that constantly threatened to break her more often than not, she would lock horns with unrelenting and dangerous temptations to give up on life. But every time that came up, her child, younger brother, and mother came to her mind. The city of glitz and glamour, of plenty and prosperity, of milk and honey, that she had been told of before she arrived in the concrete jungle called Durban, was a fairy tale. The sweet stories she always heard about, as far as life in the city is concerned, only came out as sour realities that she could not understand. She was no different from those while the city sleeps behind the muted lights in towering office blocks. They would work, preparing the city for tomorrow's deluge of official staff. These are black African women who scrub floors, polish desks, empty waste bins, sweep carpets, and work beyond the official hours of work, and thus always get home tired. All this for that which would never recognize their right to decent pay, for a proper livelihood. She was therefore typical of any other black woman, a misfit in an anti-black European type of city. She was part of those, the cities of the well-off and value-protecting property investors and developers would always chase away. That pushes them away to the darkest fringes of society, to the spaces of nobodies. After a hard day's work, this is the story, the lived reality and experience of Miss Lydia Malinga, a young black woman, originally from eShowe in KwaZulu-Natal, who set about to make a living in the concrete jungle called Durban. Lydia did not say all she said to us out of nowhere, not at all. Whatever we came to speak about came out of several issues that we got to reflect on while waiting in the queue. Our collective irritation over the slow pace of the service triggered a conversation that touched on many things. We spoke about the lived experiences of particularly young black folks beyond what we have been taught in the classroom. As such, there are so many things that we can take out and thus learn from Lydia Malinga's life story and daily encounters. There are many Lydia Malingas out there, that is young women and men, particularly black, who die in silence, who die many times every day. They believe that they have no recourse as far as their social and economic problems are concerned. They feel that the world has conspired against them. They feel hopeless, helpless, and powerless. Just like any other underprivileged human being trying to make meaning of their lives in the ever-bustling cities that constantly threaten to vomit them to the margins of the margins, to crush them into nobodies, to throw them into spaces they are bound to suffocate in. These are people who constantly hustle to see the next day, huffing like yoked oxen in the service of an economic behemoth that cares little about their well-being, and as they push against the odds to put something on the table for themselves and their families, they face fires, unfavorable laws, and insensitive labor markets, yet still dare to wake up. The following day, this is the daily life of finding oneself sandwiched between trolley pushers and street sweepers, being overwhelmed by the uncompromising car hooters in the rush hours of the day, and drowning in the whistles of street vendors passionately luring people to buy their goods. In the life story and daily experiences of Lydia, typical of a black person and a woman, we can take out many things. We can take out the fact that we live as parents who are supposed to take care of our families. Lydia had to take care of her ill mother, who could no longer work, and her little brother, who is not yet ready for the world of work. We live as commuters who have to use public transport from one place to another, particularly to and from work. We find ourselves constantly suffering the implications of the ever-increasing cost of transportation. The rising cost of car parts and the cost of petrol add to the burden of having to socially reproduce ourselves. The dire implications of these rising costs of petrol and car parts are that such costs are mindlessly passed on to commuters by minibuses, taxi operators. The operators are themselves the victims of the corruption and many injustices in the automotive industry, as well as of the car insurance industry. It is for this reason that collusion in the automotive industry, particularly automotive car parts dealers, has been looked at in this work. Lydia's story is also a story of workers who work for wages in capitalist firms and industries to make a living yet remain poor because they are extraordinarily underpaid yet overworked. It is also a story of consumers who have to buy the very commodities they reproduce in capitalist firms or industries. Lydia's story is the story of having to bear with the pressure brought about the increase in the prices of goods as, so we are always told, the cost of transportation of goods so. It is also a story of our realities as clients, customers, who use financial institutions such as commercial banks and insurance companies, which have been found on multiple occasions to be mercilessly ripping us off daily. People, for instance, are the constant victims of unauthorized deductions, of illegal debit orders by commercial banks, as well as blatant refusals to process claims by insurance companies and medical aid schemes. As such, people always find themselves having to fight for the reversal of illegal debit orders and insurance payouts. To add insult to injury, the very reversal of illegal debit orders has become another avenue for profit-making by commercial banks. This is because commercial banks charge a fee for the reversal of illegal debit orders. Is this not ironic? Again, Lydia's lived reality is a story that we also live as students in pursuit of capacitating ourselves to meaningfully participate in various social, economic, cultural, and technical roles in society. Lydia, for instance, had to apply for funding to be able to study so that her aspirations of living a better life become a reality. There is plenty of evidence of people's personal experiences with medical aid schemes, beyond far-fetched arguments by columnists and scholars who academize people's pain for accolades and turn extension, and beyond the assumptive logic of critical political economy traditions. The life of a black person is akin to a mark of Cain in an anti-black racist world. We thus enter the arena of political economy as the condemned. We come as the ontological underdogs, not merely of the labor markets or the economy, but of the entire world, that as it is not ours, and has been designed without us in mind, or with us not being human beings proper. The assumption that the political economy, particularly the critical traditions, would automatically cleanse of this existential guilt overlooks the far-reaching implications of the asymmetry of power relations at the level of who is said to be human and what kind of power structures, institutions, policies, laws, etc. supports the dominant assumptions. To what extent, then, does participation in the economy present possibilities to cleanse off this ontological mark of Cain? This ontological badge of existential guilt that feeds off anti-black racism. What if Lydia's mistreatment and exploitation by the economic order are a result not merely of her being a worker, but of her being an ontological underdog? That is, as someone not worth decent pay and humane treatment because she falls in the category of those considered less human, black, and woman, and not primarily a human. And perhaps it is at this point that the de Beauvoir question becomes relevant. What does it mean to be a problem? The important thing here is to note the difference between having a problem and being a problem. The former presupposes one's recognition of their humanity, while the latter presupposes a situation in which one's humanity is questioned at best and denied at worst. The critical political economy tradition cannot afford to conveniently paper over this reality. What does it mean to be positioned not as a positive term in a counter-hegemonic struggle, for example as a worker, but to be positioned in excess of hegemony, to be a scandal in its assumptive, foundational logic, to threaten its discursive integrity? Why are black folk the indispensable sacrificial lamb vital to its sustenance? The very reality of seeing Lydia beyond the category of a mere worker, but rather as a human being, is an ontologically revolutionary act on its own. This is owing to the invisibility of black people in an anti-black racist order. The worker in good faith does not in any way help a black person who enters the labor market as an ontological suspect, not worth any economic claims. For example, better wages for one's work. The attitude of the labor market, for instance, to an ontological suspect is very much presupposed by what the power structure says they have and do not have a claim on. The stories of black, mostly women, farm workers subjected to hard labor without decent pay, of the exploitation of black women who are domestic workers, of commercial banks charging high interest rates on loans and bonds when it comes to black people, of high premiums on insurance offers, of being paid less than your white counterpart as a black person while doing the same work, starkly point to the fact of a black person entering the economy, the labor market, as an ontological suspect. The character and conduct of the financial, labor, commercial, commodity, etc. markets are determined by the prevailing value system on who has the right to make particular claims and receive certain offers, rewards, and incentives. Of course, there are always attempts to hide this reality. Such attempts assume various guises. In most cases, the technical speak is deployed to hide the perniciousness of this anti-black racist violence. In the case, for instance, of commercial banks or the refusal by insurance companies to process claims, they would say, "We have processes in place and our systems have proven to be effective over time." In case the customer did not read the fine prints, well, we are open to renegotiating the deal and see what's possible. In this, we are offered some professional entity that can never discriminate because it is guided by a sound value system of transparency and responsiveness. The capitalist political economy power structure is born of deadly assumptions. These assumptions tell the entire white world how to treat certain people. They organize people in a particular way. Out of these assumptions, policies are made, programs are pursued, institutions are designed, and a particular value system, for example in law economics, is cultivated and entrenched. As such, discriminatory practices get deeply institutionalized. The maltreatment of black people is therefore not a mere accidental predisposition by crazy individuals in power, but a deeply embedded systematic and structural reality. It defines the social, economic, cultural, and political institutions. This oppression is thus not accidental, but structured and systematic. We must realize and understand racism as a defining and organizing logic of exploitative class and patriarchal power relations, and not as an epiphenomenon. If these are the realities of black people in this world, then people like Lydia face more problems than mere inclusion in the economic structures of the prevailing order. The truth of the matter is that to acknowledge the dehumanization of black people under a racist, patriarchal, capitalist order, yet still treat the racial question as epiphenomenon, is nothing short of approaching the ontological question of black people's humanity, or lack therefore, in extraordinary bad faith. The fact of the matter, therefore, is that Lydia is every poor black person, who experiences the violence of the prevailing anti-black, racist, patriarchal, misogynistic power structure every day of their lives. And this is the very reality of the asymmetry of power relations under capitalism. These are power relations that are sanctioned by a settler, colonial, neocolonial, and capitalist imperialist logic. It is this the context in which the means of livelihood, from food production to access to healthcare, is in the hands of a tiny white minority that owns the means of life. As such, only those assumed to be human with a social, cultural, and economic claim are worth enjoying them. If we do not realize the total oppressive nature of the society in which we live, we will simply run from the fire into a frying pan. That is from one crisis to another. We must understand that without radically transforming the social, economic, and cultural landscape, we cannot escape the conditions of want, incompleteness, vulnerability, pain, violence, etc., that the prevailing system constantly and uncompromisingly metes out against. What then do we make of a social, cultural, and economic system that overlooks the real-life stories, experiences, and encounters of the most marginalized in society, and yet still claims to be for everyone? What does it mean to parade and thus take pride in ideals that never take into consideration power relations that are inherently at the odds with a just and equal society? What would be the implications, for instance, of a policy-making process that overlooks the lived experiences of ordinary Black people and women? The unity of the oppressed and exploited across the world can only come about when each of us recognizes the humanity of other people that we have to wage the struggle for freedom and equality with. Without that, whatever we claim to be a struggle would be nothing else but a reproduction of particularly unequal power relations. The fact of the matter is that in an anti-Black, racist world order, white people who have benefited from centuries of racially inspired and politically engineered wars of dispossession, genocides, racism, patriarchy, and sexism, and still benefits from the current order, will never give up their privileges. We must assert ourselves as Black people so that white people begin to see us as fellow human beings. This is what should presuppose the unity of working class against capitalism and imperialism. What would it mean to wage a struggle, for instance, against a capitalist ruling class without recognizing other fellow fighters as human beings who are worthy of respect? If the struggle of the oppressed and exploited across the world has to achieve far-reaching changes, overcoming racism should not be understood as an epiphenomenon, but rather a reality that constitutes class exploitation. Otherwise, we will have anti-capitalist racists, to say nothing of anti-imperialism, capitalists, racism, as structural power rears its ugly head in rather different and sometimes weird ways, and we must understand how that manifests or happens. Racists will never say, "I am racist," but we can discern particular ways of living, doing, and thinking anchored by a racist order. That is racist. It is for this reason that our quest for a just and equal world should be prevented from producing and reproducing anti-capitalist racists under the guise of class struggle that erases other people's experiences. Racism tears apart the humanity of Black folks, and this cannot be ignored for the mechanical unity of the working class. When one is Black in an anti-Black racist world, your wealth, talent, and role as a Black person does not matter. In 2013, Oprah Winfrey, an African-American billionaire woman and media mogul, was not allowed to buy a handbag at an upscale Swiss boutique in Switzerland by a racist sales assistant. Weird justifications or explanations were offered. The store owner, Trudy Hortz, had this to say: "I don't know why she talked of racism. I'm sorry, but perhaps she's being a little oversensitive here. Maybe she was somewhat offended because she was not immediately recognized in the store." At the annual meeting of world leaders, the World Economic Summit in 2020, a racist incident took place where a picture of a Black climate change activist by the name of Vanessa Nakate was cropped out so that only young white activists remained. The way that incident, albeit reflective of systematic anti-black racism, was justified by the media that it was a terrible mistake never really held any water. Nagate's remarks made more sense. Many African activists experience the same erasure but feel unable to speak up. The violence of an anti-black racist order on black people is constant and pernicious. It is not and can never be said to be violence because its proponents and beneficiaries want us never to perceive it as something to be overcome. We deal with this reality and its ontological implications in the upcoming book, The Tyranny of Unquestioned Assumptions. We cannot afford to pander to the politics of perfidy, of pelf, and of violence, particularly at this moment when we must organize ourselves so that we decisively upset power relations that sustain an insensitive and inhumane order. We must deal with the power relations that make possible particular tendencies, attitudes, and realities that extraordinarily disempower the bulk of the population every day. The basis of this work, therefore, is the lived realities and experiences of the oppressed and exploited, not abstract laws of economics. We are informed by the painful experiences and aspirations of the underprivileged, not the infatuations of politicians and bourgeoisie thinkers. It is the facts of life of the ordinary people, not of the figments of the fatal imaginations of those who passionately and constantly churn out lies and continue to benefit from the reality of unequal power relations. What, after all, could be of revolutionary politics not grounded in ordinary people's realities and experiences? The fact of the matter is that where we locate the source of our sorry state of affairs becomes the basis for the possibility, or lack thereof, to develop a language of critique and praxis for a truly liberated society. Our lives experiences multiple assaults from the dominant neoliberal, capitalist, imperialist system. This is the reality, for instance, from lack of access to food, healthcare to the price of a school uniform. The fact of the matter is that the medical aid establishment does not care about the well-being of people. What it cares about is profits. It cares about making more money by every means possible under the sun. There is no mere accusation nor a silly and convenient snipe at the private healthcare and medical aid scheme system. There is an avalanche of evidence about the inherent insensitivity of a profit-based medical regime. So the 2018 Competition Commission's provisional findings in its inquiry into the country's private healthcare sector, particularly against the role players in the South African private healthcare industry, namely Mediclinic, Netcare, and Discovery, is a case in point. It confirmed the fact that people are ruthlessly being ripped off day and night. These are private entities that are said to have a combined market share of 83% of the private healthcare sector in South Africa. What we want to underscore in the main, as reflected in the story of Lydia, is that while we may live in different ways in different spaces for whatever reason, we are primarily and most importantly human beings. We are human beings with particular needs that cannot be compromised. And once compromised, our sense of being human is taken away. We thus assume different identities and go about different activities, primarily because we are human beings trying to make a living within a particular set of social, economic, and cultural relations. But these social, economic, and cultural relations have so far extraordinarily fallen short of recognizing our humanity and protecting our dignity. What Lydia and many other people may think are isolated incidents that mess up their lives, that hold them back, that dampen their spirits, their zeal and zest, are not so isolated. The reality of the matter is that things such as the cost of healthcare, of bread, of transport, or even the consequence of living in an environmentally polluted area, etc., are not so isolated. Whatever different things, professionally and otherwise, we may commit ourselves to and go about under capitalism, they remain different but specific realities of a whole system that controls the entire life world. Isolating them robs us of an opportunity to see the bigger picture of what truly shapes our lived realities, experiences, and encounters. We must see the entire behemoth We must not only see its horns or tail, we must know the nature of the beast we are dealing with, lest we go about half-hearted programs of liberations. Owing to the inherent patriarchal, sexist, misogynist, homophobic, and transphobic nature of the settler, colonial, capitalist, imperialist political economy, Lydia could be that woman who drowns in her tears because society denies her sexual agency and spiritual liberty. She could be that woman who has never told anyone that she was raped when she was 12 years of age. She could be that woman who always watches her back at work because of male chauvinists and psychopaths who do not see her as a colleague but a potential sexual object. She could be that woman who screams as a result of the physical abuse from her lover, have become evening lullabies to the entire community. It could be that woman who wishes to cry when it rains so that her tears cannot be seen because of the everyday trauma she encounters in the world. She could be that woman who is told to leave her emotions at home, in the toilet, in the bathroom, because this job requires no emotions, and neither should work be affected by your problems. She could be that woman in Palestine who watches in utter despair, her child being mercilessly killed by Israeli soldiers for just playing on the other side of the border. She could be that woman in Yemen who is a victim of male-triggered wars and rape. She could be that woman in Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, etc., who works in the sweatshops and thus get paid next to nothing to make her life a proper living. And yes, Lydia could be that woman we never think of when we arrive at those designer stores to buy the latest of designer clothes, for we never think of where the material that makes such products comes from and under what conditions they were produced. This is even though there is plenty of evidence that most of our brand name clothes are manufactured in sweatshops, which are in developing countries by the poor and largely black women. Lydia could be this particular woman with universal realities, and thus a woman who is shouldering this globalization wave, yet remaining its prime victim. Of course, she could be those women we misrepresent, misname, unname, and therefore conveniently reduce to quantifiable, disposable, and exploitable objects to balance business books, to reach our corporate targets, and this would simply be because power is exercised epistemologically in the dual practice of naming and evaluating. In naming or refusing to name things in the order of thoughts, existence is recognized or refused, significance assigned or ignored, beings elevated or rendered invisible. Once defined, the order has to be maintained, serviced, extended, operationalized. Naming the other is the other. It is within the complex of realities of the economic, the cultural and ecological, the personal, the political, and many other realities, therefore, that our lives are constituted and reconstituted, packaged and repackaged, defined and redefined, organized and messed up. This is what we have to grapple with in pursuit of our freedom, dignity, and humanity. We must endeavor to rescue life from this morass of racist, sexist, homophobic, capitalist, imperialist relations of production. If we painstakingly make visible to the naked eye and understandable to unsuspecting minds the nature of the prevailing neoliberal capitalist imperialist relations, many people would come to realize that the inbuilt contradictions of the capitalist mode of production are systematic, interrelated, and challengeable. The system of capitalism is not self-engineered. It is rather committedly administered by a dominant race, whites, at the expense of blacks and many other non-white groups, by the profit-thirsty capitalist class at the expense of the working class, by the ruling gender, which is male, at the expense of the woman, by a homophobic, heteronormative, and establishment at the expense of different sexual orientations. It is for this reason that Uta Phillips had to say, "The earth is not dying, it is being killed. And those killing have names and addresses. Lest we be too abstract and mechanical in our critique and approach, it is not only important but also necessary to take a nuanced approach and avoid any straitjacketness, to better understand the complex and everyday dynamic realities of our social, political, economic, and cultural conditions. We must be specific about the manifestation and operation of the logic of capitalism. This is more so given the fact that the modern wave of globalization brings about realities that somewhat challenge us to rethink certain things about the societies we live in, things we had known for quite some time but no longer hold water. A case in point is the reality of precarious employment, thanks to neoliberal influence of the labor market, which is believed to have produced a precariat. This is a social and economic cohort that faces different challenges from those a typical proletariat of an industrial era had to face, unlike the latter, which had work security marked by a fixed time of employment, labor rights, and guarantee of work incentive. The former has no such features whatsoever. It lacks a secure work-based identity. These are the realities of the indisputable changes in the so-called world of work under a neoliberal order. A nuanced approach is also important because even the precariat is far from being homogeneous. The teenager who flirts in and out of the internet cafe while surviving on fleeting jobs is not the same as the migrant who uses his wits to survive, networking feverishly while worrying about the police. Neither is similar to the single mother fretting where the money for next week's food bill is coming from, or the man in his 60s who takes casual jobs to help pay medical bills. But they all share a sense that their labor is instrumental, opportunistic, and precarious. By taking a dialectical approach that sees and considers the whole, that is, the totality of the system that has conquered and therefore controls the entire life world, disarticulate it, that is, explore the parts of the whole, particularly their relations to each other, and reassemble it. That is, make it a whole again. Having understood what the whole consists of, we would be breaking the glass ceiling of capitalist propaganda. This is propaganda that only offers us glamorous effects without offering us the gloomy and ugly causes. For instance, the man who builds a multi-million-dollar mansion might be that person who stays in a shack. That black woman whom GDP ignores is the one who makes possible human labor due to her unpaid work. Hence arguments from some radical feminists that the male economy wouldn't be possible without the unpaid labor of women. That ring that becomes an expensive gift to a wife, husband, or colleague is the product of child labor in the DRC and other environmentally distracted communities in many parts of the world. The classy, glamorous, and glitz-infested world offered to us by the apologists of the political economy of capitalist imperialism falls flat on its face when it is assessed against the lived realities and actual experiences of the poor and workers. That is, when it is looked at and judged against conditions of the oppressed and exploited people of the world. What else could be the basis of this irrelevance? An ultimate collapse of the political economy of capitalism. If it were not the real realities of the very people capitalism mindlessly exploits and pauperizes. Under capitalism, the economic fundamentals are said to be right in place where shareholders have the prospect of an increase of dividends, when company earnings show the potential of soaring, when workers are at the mercy of markets, irrespective of the social, economic, and environmental implications of such an economic system. This irrespective of whether people have access to clean and drinkable water, education, live in an environmentally safe and healthy society. We must challenge the fundamental logic of capitalism and expose its hollow claims. We must do so particularly as far as life in general is concerned. We must do this from where we are. My name is Zamaxusi Nkabinde. I am from the foothills of the Drakensberg in a small town known as Winterton, and thank you for listening.